Welcome, Internet. This is the JupyterLab Jupyter Notebook weekly dev meeting, February 17th, 2017. And it looks like on the HackPad we first have Jamie. Jamie?
Hi, everyone. Let's see here. Right, so next week we're going to have a tutorial for the team, and we might have the JupyterLab. We'll probably have the JupyterLab meeting an hour earlier, and we'll post a note on Gitter if that's the case. That's all I have.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Ian?
So I've been doing continued iteration on hierarchical collaborative models with more complex objects. In particular, what I've found need for is sort of an intermediate object in that a JSON representation of something is a bit dumb, and then the full live model, something like a cell model or an output area model, is something that really can't be serialized easily over the network. Having the model and all of its functions can't be easily serialized, right? So what I need is something that's more like an intermediate object, something that's so each of these things can be seen as sort of morally a map or a list or something like that. And if you want to serialize them, you have to convert them into something like a map or a list. So the output area, for instance, is a list of things, or can be seen as a list of things, can be sort of cast into a list of things that can be sent over the network. And so what I'm finding we need is something that knows, is when you register something as being a collaborative object, you need to provide some sort of function that knows how to take it to and from one of these simpler data types. And so I've been playing with different ways of exposing that API, but the essential problem is that. So let's see, what did I put in the HackPad? Yeah, so one of the downsides to that is that there are several different types which are very different from each other that we would want to be able to sync. You can do primitives, you can do JSON objects, or you can actually have things like lists and maps that are smarter. And I want all of these things to work, which means that unfortunately I've had a certain amount of runtime type checking, which I'm not particularly happy about, but I don't see a way around at the moment. So I guess I'm pinging everybody for thoughts on that, on those issues.
What's your difference between a collaborative JSON object and, say, an observable map or vector?
A collaborative JSON object, you can't listen for changes to various fields. It's a dumb JSON blob. And so if you want something that has a little bit more, and so it is totally possible to do the whole thing with like the full JSON blob of cells getting pushed back and forth, but that's not very granular, and you can't do sort of more complex manipulations on that object. For instance, two people can't edit the cell at the same time. You can't change the output area very easily without changing the text or vice versa. So you're sort of sending more stuff than you have to.
So is a collaborative JSON object essentially the same as like a collaborative string object, but you're guaranteed that the contents are valid JSON?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Have you looked at like Rethink DB at all and some of the concepts they've used there?
So I see that as being more of a backend issue, and right now I'm using the Google Real-Time API for the backend, and at some point I'd like to look into that, but I don't think that's the issue at the moment.
Well, I'm talking about for the front end use, because it sounds like what you're describing is like a live JSON database, which is what RethinkDB is, whether you run it on the back end or whether you run it in there.
Just in terms of the API, no, I haven't really looked at the way that they've worked that out. I'll look at that.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, particularly from the notification side of things, they've got some pretty well thought out ways to, like, I care about this particular stuff in this JSON blob. Let me know when that changes.
Sure. I know that. So Steve has been doing some monumental work this week on getting observable JSON objects up and running. So that will certainly be useful. But in terms of converting it to a smarter object, that's an important piece that is.
Yeah, so the hierarchical part is missing, is what you're saying.
Well, the hierarchical part, but now say I give you a JSON representation of a cell. That in itself is not a cell model. It's missing, all sorts of functionality. So we want to be able to take that and convert it to a cell. Very similar to the factory methods that already exist in the undoable vector, but sort of the next step forward in terms of complexity and intelligence of those objects.
Steve and I talked about this when he was doing the stuff that he's been doing. One thing that you might consider as a pattern is the way Backbone implements models, because they know you have arbitrary data, but they want to give it a uniform interface. So they give you a get and a set method, and you pass in the key and the values. But the trouble with that is when you go like a level deeper or two level, when you have arbitrarily complex substructures, like at some point you are faced again with the same problem of, I now have this arbitrary key, 3 levels deep in my object that is also something I want to keep tabs on. So it might be the case that that does is kick the key down the road.
I dropped there for a second, sorry.
Oh, okay. Basically, what I was saying is the Backbone model is an attempt to sort of deal with giving structure to these arbitrary data objects, but it might turn out to be not what you want. It might turn out that at some point you really just, the way around it is to create a JSON schema or something, and not like give up the idea of completely arbitrary blobs of JSON, but I'm not sure.
Fortuitously, Min just pushed an npm package for our existing notebook schema.
Mm-hmm.
So that's now part of the MB format repo. It's a Python package and now a repo that contains the raw schema.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I just want to point out that I think we should do whatever we can to avoid a situation where we're taking like arbitrarily complex JSON structures and reifying each level of the hierarchy into some separately observable object, because to handle then nested changes or top level changes, you end up with this notification problem where you have to like start stepping down the hierarchy and emit several notifications based on where you're at. And it becomes very complicated. And I've been down that path before and it failed. This is why I was bringing up RethinkDB, because you have one central manager of this arbitrarily complex bag of stuff, and you basically can assign your listeners basically become queried listeners. So if anything changes in that bag of stuff, the RethinkDB figures out which listeners match that query and notify them appropriately. So it's a basically centralized notification dispatch versus hierarchical dispatch. And in my experience, that type of hierarchical dispatch is just fraught with perils. So we should avoid that at all costs. I'm not saying we should use RethinkDB. I'm just saying that we should understand it and see what concepts and problems it solved, because clearly they've thought about it more than we have at this point.
Yeah, I guess this also brings up some of the graphing query languages that have come out as well. Ian, how do you see the workflow working with your intermediate object versus the actual cell object? Do you see conversion? Do you see copying from your intermediate object? Do you see the intermediate object forming the basis of your cell model, and then your cell model's built around that or inherits from it or something?
I see conversion.
Conversion.
Yeah.
So I listen to changes on my intermediate object.
So
what do you mean by conversion?
okay, so the pattern that I had worked out with Steve was there are these various observable objects, and we maybe have a real-time version of this that we link into the back of the one that is in the live model. So, for instance, there is the observable vector, which holds the cells, holds the cell models, and we could say, well, we can link that to a real-time vector, and so that changes in the real-time vector get passed on to the vector of cells in the notebook, right? And so the idea is sort of the same, where we say we have a cell which has some sort of intermediate representation, and it is linked into the intermediate representation, which is a live real-time object.
So I have a cell model, and it's subscribing to changes from this intermediate cell data representation, this data model,
yep.
Real-time data model or whatever. And okay, and this real-time data model lives separately from the cell model. It's getting notifications through however that things are changing, or it's changing itself, sending out notifications, and then the cell is listening to the corresponding cell is listening to these changes and copying over the new text. It's modifying the actual cell model that's being used to render based on notifications to the real-time data model.
So the idea is once you link into it, it is for all intents and purposes the same data structure. So the item, say that the fields we're interested in changing for a cell are, say, the source, the output area, and the MIME type, say. And so each of these things can sit in a map, which can be linked to an intermediate representation of that map, and be, for all intents and purposes, those are the same.
So rather than seeing two separate object instances, you see one cell model that is referring to the real-time model?
Yeah.
Okay. So the cell model is really a wrapper around the real-time data model.
In a sense, yeah. With the additional smarts that a cell model has, that the real-time does not.
Okay. Thanks.
And again, the rationale for this is just that having the JSON representation, which we already have, doesn't allow for very granular changes or very interesting collaborative models.
Because it doesn't let you query for stuff inside the structure, query on changes inside the. So for example, I can't say when the metadata changes in my JSON structure, then I want to trigger this.
Right.
Thanks. Is any other comments or feedback for Ian? Or anything else you need to say?
Well, there was one more thing I wanted to bring up, which was, and this is more for Darian, the restore, the application restore functionality has hard-coded in, which makes sense, has hard-coded in when it's trying to reopen a widget it will try to reopen the same files in it and goes to the file browser plugin to try to reopen that file. This has been problematic if you have more than one file browser mounted, as I do for the stuff that I've been working on. So when you reload the page, it tries to reload the file from the normal file browser, not the file browser that the file actually
Okay.
And I don't know a good way forward for that.
Okay, so actually that's a problem across the board, because it's not actually using the file browser necessarily. It's using a command that the file browser registered. So there's lots of other things that use the same command, and it's the file operations : open command, and that's actually used across the board. So if you have more than one file browser, you need to either you need a command that takes into account that there might be multiple file browsers. Maybe there's some sort of manager or something like that, and basically delegates to the correct file browser. Or we need to have a different strategy. But basically, a restorer can only run a command, so it's our job to make sure the command is capable of doing the right thing. But the solution isn't exactly obvious, but it's not specific to the file browser. It's just that whatever command we invoke has to be flexible enough to deal with it. Mm-hmm. If this is the point that you're stuck at right now, we can talk it through together maybe next week and try to resolve it.
This is more annoyance than a blocking point.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, basically, if it turns out that we're going to have multiple file browsers on the page, and they're going to be dealing with different sources, then we need a solution to this problem in general. If it turns out that you have a special case and it's always going to be a third-party plugin that adds a second file browser, then it's got to be the responsibility of the third-party plugin to blow away the old command and create a new command that does all the work it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Oh yeah. Wait, do we have a way of blowing away old commands right now? Like, if you're not the person who registered file operations : open, you don't have that disposable or anything. Is there a way for you to replace an existing command?
No.
What if you try to register? What if you try to register?
It'll give you an error if you try to register.
Oh, does it? Okay.
Yeah. You get a disposable back, I think, where if you own it, you could be the one who gets rid of it. But I think we probably need to allow for plugins to overwrite existing commands. That's probably a thing we need to offer.
I'm pretty sure we had this discussion back in the day and decided against that.
Ian?
Yeah. That sounds like something we might decide.
Are you seeing errors from having two file browsers that are registering conflicting commands?
Well, currently they're not registering conflicting commands. I have them namespaced to register different commands.
What if I think the way to handle this is to make the file browser model a token that the file browser widget uses, so that you could provide an alternate real-time aware file browser model to the application.
Yeah, the whole point of commands is for looking up key bindings and menu items and command palette stuff that should more or less be decoupled from the thing that's doing the action, but not decoupled in a way that it's going to be like swappable at runtime, like tokens are in the dependency injection system. And the reason for that is it's done that way explicitly to discourage people from making APIs that are entirely untype safe through the use of commands. Because if we allow overriding commands, then anybody's going to come in there and just start swapping out commands and building entire APIs that are all command driven. And usually there are better ways to express that pattern, like what Steve just suggested, by passing around models instead of just saying, oh, just call this command, and then I might replace it, I might not.
But we're going to run into situations where things, not just the restorer, but the restorer is a good example, but also things like the command linker, where you have a file name in a document and you want to link it to a command that's going to open the file name. We're going to have these things that call utility commands Right, and those utility commands that open things, in Ian's case, open means something different than in the unmodified JupyterLab case. In the unmodified JupyterLab case, there's one source of all files. In Ian's case, there's two sources of all files, but it should not require all the other things that restore using that command.
I would disagree that there's two sources. There should be one source that Ian owns that may slave to the non-real-time file model for some things and his own for others. But this is still, as far as everything else is concerned, there should be an abstract model that it's just using.
Okay, so
another option, if you absolutely want to have stuff implemented as commands, the model that you pass around could have the command IDs as attributes on the model, and then things that want to build a UI that call those commands, like they've got the command ID because the model provided it. I think, and the other point about namespacing commands is that when you start talking about wanting to hook up like debug loggers or tracing or any kind of that kind of stuff, and you're starting to hook up to like the command executed signals on the command registry, you want to know what command was executed because you get the command ID, but more importantly than that, like you want to kind of know where that command came from, which is, so the ID should be namespaced really to the plugin that provided the command or the package that provided the command. That's again, this is all just opinionated stuff, but that's the way I was thinking about it when I built the system.
Yeah, that's reasonable. Steve, can you walk through just briefly how to solve this problem in a way that only requires one plugin author to work with the one plugin they're working on?
Right. So there was already an open issue to extract the file browser model from the file browser widget so that it's a separate entity in Document Manager, partially for this reason, but also so the plugin will take that model as a token. The file browser plugin will take that model as a token. And so if Ian wants to replace that that plugin with a real-time aware plugin, then he can instantiate both a real-time file browser model and a non-real-time file browser model and expose one thing that either he does as a real-time or not. So like it's an enhanced file browser model that implements that interface.
So this really doesn't have much to do with, this problem doesn't have much to do with real-time or not real-time. It's more just you could have two different file browsers mounted, basically.
Yeah, you connect to a separate server, so you have two different file browsers. One is for your local server, one's for the foreign server, and you still want to be able to just double-click on a file and open it. And when you double-click on a file, it's calling file operations open, let's say. How do we implement that without...
Okay, then we have a different problem because basically our current file browser model is a current working directory model. So if you want to have multiple current working directories in the application, then yeah, Ian's right, you have to rethink what we're doing here. Where each of those is an independent, like is there there should be a current working directory of JupyterLab, but you might want a different file browser to be in a different working directory.
Okay, actually, that while that sounds like an issue, I think it's a sort of a different issue because none of the restorations care about your current working directory. They just give a path to open, irrespective of where the file browser currently is. It's just the idea of how do you open files that come from multiple sources with one command.
But like those commands would go to the JupyterLab level file model, the current working directory of JupyterLab. Whereas if you're interacting with the non-main, then it would have its own model in a different directory. In my estimation.
I think we should talk about this, maybe not right now.
I'll open an issue.
Yeah, let's put it on an issue.
Okay.
Thanks for bringing it up, Ian. Afshin, you're next.
Sure. So yeah, the rewrite of the 3 functionalities that add on to notebook and console is all done. The completer, now you can change a shortcut to it, and you don't have to worry about the single character restriction that I had last week. And the tooltip and the inspector all have the same pattern, and it's just it's cleaner and nicer than before. One side effect of this work was that we came to the conclusion that all shortcuts need to be listened to on the capture phase, which is how we originally were doing it, but then we switched to bubble and now we've switched back. It shouldn't really affect anyone, but it is a thing to note. It might affect you if you want to add a shortcut to, say, the notebook, and you want that shortcut to only work in edit mode. You'll notice that now the selectors for that all have a focus pseudo selector, so that things that take away the focus from the cell you're editing but aren't truly edit mode, like when you use input and you have a little form element that you're putting values in, those things ought not fire edit command mode shortcuts. So if you notice, the selectors all have a focus pseudo selector to make sure that happens. But basically, it should be transparent for almost any shortcuts you're adding. Yeah, that's it.
Comments? Thanks. iPad Widget 6 is nearing release. I think we have 1 or 2 things that we're trying to get in for a final beta, and then a few days later, maybe in a week or so, we'll cut an RC and then have final release. We are hoping to move to Phosphor, but I guess we could talk about Phosphor when Chris comes up. And anyway, we're moving forward. We really want to cut a 6 because it's been a long time and there's a lot of people blocking on it. Let's see, Steve.
Okay. I have a 4,500 line PR that that essentially rewrites the render mime and output area models. What prompted it was that we wanted more interactivity on what a renderer receives, in that it can interact with the data and the metadata, and other renderers that have the same view of that model can respond accordingly, including the cell model itself. So Ian committed the observable map, and I just ran with that, and the thread unfortunately kept pulling and the 4,500 lines later, everything's a lot cleaner. I think the biggest thing is the output area, or an individual output model can now be expressed as just a rendered MIME model that is using NB format data. So I've actually moved that to the render MIME folder, as the output model lives there. So it's decoupled from the output area. It's a separate thing that only uses the NB format interfaces, and so you get a live data model for the output. And the widget, what we used to call the output widget, is really just a render MIME instance output, a rendered widget. So it's no longer, that was in output area as a special case thing, but now it's moved into render MIME. Also, so the metadata fields of the cell and the notebook were also amenable to this observable map. So those are converted over. And so the cell data tools metadata editor now uses that instead of our old model of having the cursors associated with it. So you can just feed it directly that metadata, that live JSON observable, and you can interact with it. So that's more widely usable in that sense. And also there was some, unfortunately, in the output area model as it stood before, it had execution on it, and as a result, it was getting the standard out requests from the server and putting those in line with the model temporarily, even though they're not part of the notebook format. So it moves the execution to the widget so that the widget can create widgets in response to standard in requests, but they're not part of the model. They're just inline in that widget that is executing the request. So that if you have multiple views, they wouldn't see that standard in request. There's only one canonical widget that was making that request. And then, so when you clear the model, the standard in requests get cleared as well. But so there's no longer that weirdness of temporarily putting standard in with the standard out that was never getting put to disk. And in general, just took that opportunity to clean up the render mime and output area models. Thought about how I'd previously gone through the widget hierarchy to make those use the same patterns, and I thought about what that pattern would look like on the model side. Wrote up, there's another issue I'll link to, of what I think that should look like in terms of allowing you to compose factories for submodels up the line and have a consistent interface for the model yourself and the model, how to create the model to and from JSON, and a standard like the command signal that your child model has changed so that it can propagate up. So Ian, we'll have to talk more about what that should look like, and in light of real-time collaboration. So I think we're going to need to have more extended conversations before I go much further with this idea. But at the very least, moving things to the render mime, the output area, the output model to the render mime, giving the renderers a live data model will satisfy things like Altair that want to dynamically add PNG output, or just in general modify their existing mime model. So the render mime that was selected to be rendered has full capability to interact with the mime bundle that was given. And that's it.
Can the render mime that was selected reject the request to render and
Yes, so what we had before was this thing called is sanitizable, is safe, but instead now trusted is part of, you always know whether the model is trusted, is part of the model, and it's read-only at the render mime level. And you always get a sanitizer. We have a default sanitizer in the app. If you don't override it, render mime will give you one. So you've always got a sanitizer, and you always know whether the output is trusted. So we just so those all get the is safe and is sanitizable get collapsed into a can render, and it gets the full model. And so it knows enough at that point. It knows there will be a sanitizer, and based on whether the model is trusted, it can decide whether it can render or not. So the render mime will go through in preferred order and find the one that can render and select that. So in your case, iPad widgets, if there was no kernel, you could reject that, and then it would find the next one. So that satisfies that.
Man, I'm looking at your PR. It's huge. It's ginormous.
The thread just kept pulling, and I wanted to keep going to the cell and notebook, but I just because I was still pulling, but I capped it off as best I could, and yeah, there it is.
Okay, I'm gonna try to browse through it today, see what I could see. Any other comments or applause for Steve or anything?
Yeah, as many eyes on the review as possible would be lovely.
4,500 lines. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I really didn't mean for it to be that big. It just the changes all were coupled, unfortunately.
Right. You did delete 400 lines, so that's good, I guess. Maybe. Chris, do you want to give us an update on Phosphor?
Yep. So I finished all the package refactoring. Everything has been merged into master, and I'm actually doing the releases now. So this is 1.0 level code. I'm releasing it right now as 0.1.0, just in case I've made some mistakes and until we actually have full test coverage. But for people that want to actually install and start living on the new stuff, which will be the 1.0 code, you can go ahead and start installing those. I haven't pushed all the packages out yet. I'm doing that now, but all of this is under a namespace package. So this would be at phosphor / whatever package you want. I didn't make an org for this, so it's actually, I made a new user on NPM in order to get the namespacing stuff, because orgs cost $14 a month per user. It's not cheap. But yeah, so that's it. So all the stuff's coming out now, and we can start using it. I don't know, within 30 minutes after I'm done publishing everything. So
great. We'll probably move iPad widgets over to it, or starting today then. Thanks, appreciate that. Are there huge changes, or should it basically be moving imports, changing imports?
it's mostly going to be moving imports. The signaling API, if you're using that a lot, changes a little bit, but it's not. It's just kind of rote, find and replace stuff.
Okay. Awesome. Anybody else?
No real behavioral changes. It's really just going to be find and replace to patch your stuff up. So.
Okay. I guess that precipitates also a JupyterLab changing imports and moving everything. That's one of the reasons why we want to get iPad widgets to move over to it, so that we'll be compatible with JupyterLab.
So we're going to do this in phases. First would be to anything widget or signal related, we port over first, and then things like a vector is no longer, that's been replaced by the array extended interface. So we go through, do another pass with that, and then we'd also, the next step is to create the individual JupyterLab packages in preparation for, I mean, the reason for doing it with Phosphor was to make it more composable and amenable to plugin use. So we're going to do the same with JupyterLab. So that'll be in it. Hopefully not too extended process, but definitely a lot of work. Expect to see large line number of changes, PRs coming from that.
Just trying to get your line count up, huh? Just kidding.
The benefit is it's relatively quick work. So like if you're going to start doing iPad widget stuff, we can hop on a Hangout, and as you run into compile issues, like I can tell you exactly what to change and how to change it real quick, so you don't go running around.
Thanks.
I don't anticipate the Phosphor changeover to take long. I meant restructuring our own packages will take a while.
Right. Sorry, I had a network condition. Chris, the one thing about the optional dependencies, are you wanting to make that a specific feature that you can specify optional dependencies, or I'm fine just saying call this resolve plugin.
It's already done. It's already done and been added and merged.
Oh, you already merged it. You move fast. Okay.
Yeah,
but people can still call the resolve, right? I mean,
yeah,
the
sure.
nice thing about calling resolve is it says if it'll be loaded later on, then go ahead and register whatever, use it however.
No, that's not what it says. It's not like you get a promise back that will resolve if and when that thing becomes available, because that would require lots of transitive computation. So basically, every time you would add a thing, I'd have to search through that entire transitive graph of the thing that you added to determine whether it could be resolved at that time. So it basically becomes a really difficult problem to do what you're describing.
For the optional dependencies or for the resolving method?
I mean, they're for the resolving method. Like if you wanted a method that says, "Hey, I want a promise that's going to resolve whenever this thing can finally be fulfilled, whenever that may be," that's a much more difficult problem than what we have. What we have now is we saying, "Hey, if at application startup time, after all of the startup plugins have been registered, if you can fulfill this, give it to me." That's a much easier problem.
And that's what the resolve method does right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Anything else? All right. Goodbye, Internet.